If you've been curious about rendering tallow but felt a little overwhelmed by all of the information that's out there, don't worry, I've got you covered. I've been doing a lot of research about the most commonly asked questions and concerns about rendering tallow. And in this video, I'm going to take care of that and have you feeling confident enough to try it for yourself. You can do it. I've been making tallow for quite a while. I've tried to do all the legwork for you, and we're going to get into some step-by-step instructions on how to render it two ways, show you some shortcuts, how to use it, lots of things. Let's go. This is the beautiful tallow that we got a hold of, and tallow is typically the fat from a cow. It can be lamb, buffalo, a few other things, but this is the fat from around the organs, and it's also called suet. And throughout this video, I'm going to tell you how you can source it, things you need to be aware of from the fat you're getting, and I'm going to show you how to prepare it to render it down for your tallow. There are several ways to access your tallow to render. You can purchase it online. There's Facebook pages. You can ask a local butcher. I would highly recommend that you contact individual butchers in your area. If you have to go out to a rural area, that may actually be more likely. And these are the butchers that local farmers who raise their cattle sell to the public. Then that cow is taken to the butcher and they process it, and then it goes to the individual customer. It's a small operation. That's where I accessed it in the past. This time we had a friend who was getting some meat processed for his family, and we knew how the cow was fed, how it was finished, and he wasn't going to keep the fat for himself. So he contacted the butcher that he was using to process his meat, and that butcher otherwise was going to throw it away. So he packaged it up for us, and he did it really nice. Wet rendering is exactly that. You take the fat and you add water and a little bit of salt, and you cook that down slowly, and you let the water render out the impurities. I'll show you how that works, but that's what wet rendering is. Dry rendering is just that. It's where you take just the fat and you put it, no moisture. You actually are trying to get the moisture out of the fat. You're cooking it low and slow, and that's called a dry rendering method. We're going to get started first on the wet rendering method. I'm just going to chop up this fat that I've already got the icky parts cleaned off. I'll show you here in a minute how I do that, but I'm going to chop it up finely, just real rough, and then we're going to put about 4 cups of water in our crock pot. You could also use a saucepan, but I think the crock pot, I have a little more control of keeping the temperature really low. We're going to add the fat. Oh, and we're going to add a little bit of salt. And I'm going to add about 2, apparently pretty big, tablespoons of salt. This is a pink Himalayan salt. And that will help pull out impurities from the fat. Here's a really nice example of the fat that we got. It hasn't always looked this good in the past, but if yours does not look like this, that's fine. You just do the best you can to get some of these pieces of like skin, tendon, or sinew, and any hunks of the meat off. I'll go in a little more depth in that here in a minute, but this is just a really nice piece of the fat from around the kidneys. And I personally just chop it up. Now be careful, your hands get really slippery from the fat, and you want to be careful when you're trying to hold the knife so you don't cut yourself, because it does get slippery. You could also put this through a food processor, or you could grind it in a meat grinder. I didn't want to clean my meat grinder or my food processor, but I have a little shortcut that is way better than having to wash your equipment, and I'll show you that here in a minute. But this is refrigerated. It is not frozen. You want it to be firm. It's easier to cut up that way. You could also ask the butcher to grind it for you, but I haven't had luck with that in the past. Here's an example of some of the icky bits that I'm going to pull as much fat off of this, but that's just a big thick piece of tendon, and you don't want that in your tallow. We're going to take this over, we're going to put it in the crock pot. I'm going to start it off on low, and with the wet rendering method, you can cover it. That'll help keep the heat in and get it going faster. Now this is about 30 minutes to an hour later. This is a couple hours, and you can see it's starting to get kind of translucent. Now everything's really soft here. Secret shortcut, the immersion blender. Now keep it on the bottom. You keep it slightly tilted where one side of that rounded part is on the bottom, and you turn it off before you raise it up, because this stuff is very, very hot, and if you keep it running and raise it up, it will sling hot fat everywhere and you could get burnt, and also it's horrible to clean up. But we're just going to make a ugly fat soup, and that will render it down much faster and save you a lot of time. Now this is after about 4 or 5 hours, and the time will just depend on your fat, your temperatures, but we're going to get it off of here and go ahead and start straining it out and get ready for the next step. I have a stainless steel bowl and a metal sieve. You want to make sure it is not a plastic sieve, because this is very hot oil and it'll melt the plastic. And I have 100% cotton, I think they're called like a bar towel. I'll show you where you can get those. I think I get a pack of 5 at Walmart for about $4 or $5. You could also use cheesecloth, and we're just going to spoon out the hot oil and strain it through the towel. I got this bowl pretty full, so we're going to go over and use another bowl. Now this is still hot oil, but it has cooled down a lot, and this is a bowl, glass bowl that can handle the high temperatures. We're going to let this, we're going to squeeze as much as we can out of this, and then we'll let it sit and kind of drain out any of the excess fat. Now I probably could have let this render down a little more, but I was ready to move on. I'm going to get the excess fat out of here, try to get every last bit, and then we're going to combine what's in this bowl into the stainless steel bowl, and then we'll go to the next step. The next step, we're going to just place it in the refrigerator uncovered, and we're going to leave this overnight. And I want to go ahead and get started on the dry render method so that we can probably get that done here on this first day. Now with the dry render method, it's exactly that. We are not going to add any water or any salt. We are just putting the fat in the crock pot, like I said, or a pan if you want to keep it low and slow and watch it. But I want to be able to just kind of leave it and not have to babysit it. Now this was what I was telling you earlier about being sure you get the fat really clean beforehand. You don't want to put this meat into your tallow, because that's just going to cook down and get sort of more of a meaty smell and flavor. So we're going to get all of that off. I'll feed this big hunk of meaty bits to the chickens, but the skin and some of the pieces that aren't as pure, I will render that down as well and use that just for cooking. We won't let any of this go to waste, but the chickens will enjoy this. And see, this is cleaner, and that I'll put in the batch that will cook down for cooking. Now, some of this I can use in cooking as well, but I want to keep it really clean so that if I want to use it in my skincare products, it's going to have a milder smell. This is how I usually make my skincare products, the dry method. Another thing to keep in mind when you're sourcing the fat is that any toxins from the animal are stored in the fat. So if you do not know how the animal's been fed, whatever that animal's storing in its fat, you're going to now be consuming. Ideally, you would want grass-fed, grass-finished beef. You want to make sure they're not using any pesticides, all the things. Look how pretty that turned out. Now we're going to go put that in the crock pot and get it started. At first, I will put the lid on until it gets the temperature up, but then we will take the lid off. You can see that it causes condensation, and with the dry method, we don't want any condensation. We're trying to get all the moisture out of the fat. So we've cooked this on low, and you can see it's starting to get ready for the little shortcut. Now, you don't have to measure the temperature, but I just wanted to keep an eye on it because I would turn that up on high. As long as this is staying below 200, I feel like it's not going to cook too fast and too hard and get a strong smell. I also make sure if I find any little bits of meat in it that I get them out. That's totally unnecessary, but this is the way I like to render it to be able to use for cooking and for my face creams, body lotions, all the things. So now we're going to go ahead and put the immersion blender in here. And like I said, it is on the bottom, slightly tilted. We're not moving this up and down. We're staying on the bottom and going really slow. I make sure I turn it off, lift it out, move it, turn it back on. Make sure it's completely submerged before I turn it on and off. And now that'll render down much faster. You can see the bigger chunks, how they're light and not cooked, and the parts that have been blended up, they're getting darker. That's rendering much faster than if we'd have left them in the big chunks. Now I'll show you how I strain it off and get it stored for long-term storage. I've placed my mason jars in the oven and it's set on warm or the lowest temperature. That way I have a hot jar when I'm putting hot oil into the jar. I have a stainless steel canning funnel and a stainless steel mesh strainer. And if you'll notice, I am not stirring up the oil. I'm making sure that what is settled on the bottom of the pan is staying on the bottom. We're just going to get the oil that's on the top surface. We'll take care of that here in a minute, but for now we want this clean oil that's on the top. We'll continue to do this slowly until we get down to the part that's settled on the bottom, and I'll show you how to take care of that here in a second. But look at how beautiful this fat is. The tallow can vary in its color depending on the breed of the animal or what the animal has been fed. And my last batch was very yellow, and it was probably just the diet of the cow. This is beautiful in yellow now, but as it cools and sets up, it'll be a creamy, whiter color. Now doing it this way, it'll be shelf stable for months. That means it can just sit out on the counter at room temperature and you don't have to refrigerate it. Now we're almost finished with this method and we'll get back to the wet rendering. But first we are going to take this last little bit, and if we hadn't blended it up, you would have the bigger chunks cooked down, and that would be called cracklings. And people like to take that and salt it and eat it. It's considered a really good little snack, but we're more about efficiency today. So we're going to try to get all the bit of fat out of this. And I have this in a larger jar, and I will label it, and we'll know that this is what I'll use strictly for cooking, because it will not be the purest in smell and flavor, but it'll have a lot of flavor that'll be great for cooking. Now, one of the commonly asked questions is, how do you clean up all of that fat? Well, it's pretty much just like if you cook bacon. We're going to use paper towels or the towel we used for straining, wipe as much of it out and throw it away. That's so pretty, and we'll check back in the morning and take a look at it after it's set up and how the color changes, and we'll get back to the next step in wet rendering our tallow. Good morning. The dog's laying down here, so I'll work around it because I always do. So I stayed up late last night and I got the dry rendering done. And I have some over there. That is the one that was kind of the messy bits, but I saved that too. But this morning, I have my coffee. I have my knives. I have a bowl to put what we're going to scrape off of here. And I have a towel because there is water in here and I can get messy. So let's see what we got. Now, it's already cracking right here and it's nice and hard. Now, the reason I chose a rounded bowl, like I said earlier, was because if it were like a pot with the sides straight up, you might get kind of vacuum locked, which would be no big deal. You could break it up, but this should be easier. Ha ha ha. It is. And this looks pretty clean. Wow. And you can see I have the water here. And that has a lot of oil in it. I'm going to go dump that outside. I'm not going to dump this down my drain because it does have bits of dried fat. So I'm not going to dump that down my drain. So I'll sit that right here and just scrape off this stuff off the bottom. Now you can see we did a really thorough job when we cleaned up our fat. So I don't have a lot of junk in here. But I am going to scrape off this. You can see it's kind of the loose stuff. I'm going to go ahead and if it's loose and will scrape, I'm going to take it off. I'm just going to assume that, and that looks just like fat to me, but I'm getting it off. This is unusually clean. So here's some pictures of some examples of how yours may look when you take it out at this step. If it does have some debris like this, you just scrape that off. Repeat the process until you don't have any debris on your tallow. I'm not going to bother drying this off because the next step is going to be, we're just going to melt it down and do a second purification. That way we're going to get any more impurities that might be in this out by doing the exact same thing. So I'm going to break this up into little chunks, just so it'll melt down faster. We're not rendering it, so it doesn't have to take a long time. We're just going to put it back in the crock pot or whatever you're using to melt it down. I like the crock pot. I can leave it. It's low and slow. So see, nice, clean. Now we'll compare the smell later. There's still a little smell, but it's not offensive. I ran my water over. Okay, this time I just have 2 cups of filtered water because we're not rendering it down. It's not going to cook a long time. So I just want a little bit of water in there to help the impurities draw out and lay down in the bottom of the water. So I'm just going to cut these up in a little smaller pieces so it'll go a little faster. But I don't like how long this takes. I'm already done with the dry rendering and I like that. But we'll see if it makes a difference. Oh, I need to put some salt in here. The salt helps bring out the impurities as well, and the salt flavor does not stay into the fat. It stays in the water and gets discarded, so you don't end up with a salty tasting tallow. So I'm just going to throw in a little bit. This is just a pink Himalayan salt. Any salt would do, like a sea salt, like Redmond's mineral salts, a pink Himalayan salt. I'm just not a fan of like regular table salt, the iodized salt. I'm going to turn this on low, give that a little stir. Probably totally unnecessary. And we're just going to drop these in. You wouldn't have had to chop it up in small pieces. You could just throw your hunks in there. But like I said, I'm trying to get this done today. The fact that it's pretty clean is promising. That makes me feel good about what I got going on over here. And I think that prep work paid off. I'm actually going to pop this up on high, let it start getting warm because everything's kind of cool this morning. I'll keep an eye on it and put it back on medium if I need to. That would depend on your crock pot. Mine seemed to not run too high. I was able to run this up and down on high and medium, going back and forth yesterday, but I was here to keep an eye on it. If I wasn't going to be right here on top of it, keeping an eye on it, I would just put it on low and go. Let me get this cleaned up. So that didn't take long. It's melted down, and remember, we were no longer rendering it. We're just melting down the fat, adding a little more water, a little more salt to pull out any more impurities. But this stuff was so clean, I don't think we'll have many impurities. So let's just get this over into this pan, get it back in the refrigerator, let it get solid, and then I think we'll be able to finish this up with one final step. I've got to go to work here in a little bit, and I want to take the finished product. Hopefully I'll have it ready before I go to work. And I want to get different people's opinions on the difference in the smell between the wet rendered and the dry rendered. A blind sniff test. I'll be honest, I hope it's the dry rendered method because it's so easy. This isn't extremely hard, it's easy. This is just what I'm used to. And it cuts out a few steps. It's like I'm already done. And I started this after this. Oh, that's the salt. There's a little bit of salt that didn't dissolve in there because it is that Himalayan salt and it has a lot of minerals in it. So I'm not going to pour that last bit in. Let's get it in the fridge. This is hot down here, but it's okay right here, so be careful. We'll see. Okay, here we go. Now, that pink salt I used didn't dissolve, and it stayed in here. So hopefully it'll dissolve and sink to the bottom when we do this last rendering. So now we're going to, should be water and the debris in the bottom. Let's get it started a little bit. There we go. There we go. There we go. Now, you can see on the bottom, I have a little bit of that salt. And in the water, it's a little pink and gray, probably the salt. But otherwise, it looks really, really clean. I need this. And this is super duper clean. Super clean. So it looks really clean, but there is a little bit of the minerals from that pink salt that settled in that hole. And where I stirred that earlier, where you could hear it kind of scraping on the bottom, you could hear the minerals and it was kind of gritty. Where I stirred that right before I poured it into the bowl, that settled on the top. So I'm just going to pick those out of there with this knife. And even if I didn't, I believe it would all settle on the bottom here at this final rendering. And it actually does. I'll show you how that turns out. But for now, I'm just going to pick this out. No biggie. And next time, I won't use that mineral salt if I do a wet render again. Now we are almost finished with the wet rendering method, and I'm going to address some issues that I have with the wet render method, and I want to give you a few extra steps and make sure that we have all or as much moisture out of this as possible. And I'll talk about that a little more and show you what I do so that we can try to have a good shelf-stable wet rendered tallow that we don't have to refrigerate or freeze. At this point, we are not going to add any more water. We're just going to let it not render, we're just going to melt it down. And I am going to let it melt long enough, maybe up the heat just a little bit, because when you have added water to an oil, you are opening yourself up to mold. You are shortening the shelf life of it. And most of the people recommend, they say this can last for a couple months on the shelf, but almost all of them always say that they store it in the fridge or they freeze it. I don't want something that I need to store in the fridge or freeze. For one thing, if I'm using this in my cosmetics, it's one thing if I make it for myself and I know that I need to keep an eye out for it if it's going to get any mold, because what we're making here has no preservatives in it. It's not like what you buy from the store where it has preservatives in it. This does not. So once it's exposed to air or you put your fingers in it, you are opening it up to bacteria and opportunities for mold. So that is one of the pros to why I like the dry rendering, is because you have rendered out the majority of the moisture, if not all of it. And in this, you're adding moisture. So hopefully we're going to let this evaporate any moisture that's in it. I know people do it all the time. It just makes me a little uncomfortable knowing that I could gift someone something and they leave it out, don't use it up within a month or so, and then they go to use it and it have mold. Not a fan of that. So again, we're going to make sure we get most of this fat off and not put these utensils in the sink covered in fat. We're going to get it off as much of it as we can, and we're going to throw it in the trash. So now I'm going to turn it on high and keep an eye on it, make sure it doesn't get too hot, and I'm not going to cover it at this point. Just like when I render the dry method, you want to do it uncovered so that you're not building up any condensation. So let's get that on and keep an eye on it, and hopefully we'll get enough of this moisture to come out of it. Not covering it. About forgot. So while that's melting back down and hopefully getting the moisture out, that's a good time, I think, to talk about some of the pros and cons. The wet render method, it seems to have a milder fragrance and doesn't smell like pot roast. However, like I said, the moisture to me, and if you've watched any of my videos in the past, you will hear me talk about don't let moisture get in your oil. Don't let moisture get in your fats. The reason is mold. And I have never had any tallow product mold on me because I learned that lesson years ago and I have stayed away from any moisture. Now, I have wet rendered fats many times. However, it's been with fats that I've saved in small batches from food. I've wet rendered it and I've kept it in the fridge and I've used it in my cooking. I've stayed away from wet rendering tallow for my cosmetics, and that's the reason why. Now, if it's done correctly, and hopefully I will render this down and make sure I get the fats out, and I'll make sure you understand what I'm talking about when I finish this up. And I should be able to tell. I've been on social media groups, like Facebook groups for people that make tallow and creams and face creams and such. And many times in the comments, they come in and they go, why is there mold growing in my face cream? And obviously it's been a moisture problem. That's the con to the wet rendering, but the pro is that you have a good, pure, creamy white tallow with minimal smell. Now the cons to rendering the dry method. In my opinion, the only con is there's a slight beefy smell. It's very slight, and I'm really pleased with this batch. And as clean as we kept the fat before we started rendering it, you saw that we made sure we got out any of the ickies. That really cuts down on the beefy smell. Now, if you just cut it up and left tendons and that stringy stuff and hunks of meat, then it's definitely going to smell like meat. This is really mild. So pros, cons. And 99.9% sure I'm not getting mold in this. Never have. Now, I may not get mold in the other. We're going to do a really good job so that we can be confident in it. Now in this final stage, I'm just going to stir this and break it up until it gets melted. And then after that, I'm not going to stir it around. I'm going to let everything just settle in the bottom and let it get a good simmer. And after it starts simmering, you can see here that that's simmering out any moisture that's in the fat. Now I've got the hot jars again, and my metal funnel, my metal strainer, and my little tea cloth. Now, just like we did earlier with the dry render method, we're going to ladle everything out of here and strain it through this cloth. Now, we don't have any bits of fat hanging out in the bottom because we've already taken care of that with the other methods. But I'm still not going to stir that up, because that way, if the minerals and stuff are settled at the bottom, we'll be able to see those there at the end. Now, just like we did earlier, we are going to wipe the rim with some white vinegar on a paper towel to get the rim good and clear and get extra oil off of the rim. Then we're going to place a canning lid, a clean canning lid on the top, and we're going to place the ring. And again, the heat should help that to seal. I'll show you here in a minute how to tell if it seals and what to do if it doesn't. This is the method that I prefer, but you absolutely do not have to use the canning method. You can store these in the refrigerator or in the freezer if you like. And we're getting down to the last little bit. We're going to pour the last of it in, get this last jar sealed up, and then we'll clean out the crock pot. And I'll use a paper towel and the little cloth that I used for straining, wipe up the excess oil, and you can see there was some minerals that settled down in the bottom. I've labeled these so I can tell which batch is which. Now you can tell by tapping. When you tap on it and it sounds solid, that one has sealed. If you can hear it crinkle, that one has not sealed. We will just use the ones that have not sealed up first. They're both still shelf stable, but just to be safe. The sniff test winner goes to, drum roll, the wet render smelled the best, but the other wasn't bad at all, and it was unanimous. Both ways were still pleasant to smell. See, you can do it. I hope that cleared up any concerns and I answered all your questions. If you have any more questions, shoot me a question in the comments. I promise I'll get back to you. And if you're wondering, oh, how do I cook with this? Other ways I can use it, and how do I make my skincare? Check out these videos right here, and there's more to come. I thank y'all so much for hanging out with me. My name's Loanne, and this is a little bit of Homestead.